Picture this. It's October 27th, 1962, and a Soviet submarine commander is seconds away from launching a nuclear torpedo that would instantly kill millions of Americans and trigger World War III. The only thing stopping him? A single vote. One man's decision to say no in that submarine is literally the only reason you're alive today to watch this video. But that's just one of dozens of moments when humanity stood on the absolute edge of nuclear annihilation. You think the Cuban Missile Crisis was just a political standoff where Kennedy and Khrushchev played chicken for a few weeks. But what really happened during those 13 days in October 1962 was so much more terrifying than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. We came within minutes, sometimes seconds, of ending civilization as we know it multiple times, and most of the world never even knew how close we came. Let's start with what you probably think you know. In 1962, the Soviets started putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. America freaked out, Kennedy blockaded the island, Khrushchev backed down, crisis over. End of story, right? Wrong. That's like saying the Titanic hit some ice. The real story is so much more insane that when classified documents were finally released decades later, historians couldn't believe humanity had survived. The crisis actually started months earlier when the CIA discovered something that made their blood run cold. U-2 spy plane photos revealed that the Soviets weren't just putting defensive missiles in Cuba. They were installing medium-range ballistic missiles capable of hitting Washington, D.C., New York, and most major American cities within minutes of launch. But here's what's terrifying. By the time Kennedy found out, the missiles were already operational. We're talking about weapons that could vaporize entire cities faster than you could finish reading this sentence. From Cuba, Soviet nuclear missiles could reach targets across the United States in less time than it takes to order a pizza. The American military had maybe 4 minutes of warning before nuclear warheads would start raining down on major population centers. Kennedy's advisors were pushing him toward immediate military action. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, was literally pounding the table demanding massive bombing strikes, followed by a full invasion of Cuba. His exact words were that anything less than total war would be almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were unified. Destroy the missile sites now, invade Cuba, and deal with the consequences later. But Kennedy knew something his generals didn't want to acknowledge. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet troops were already in Cuba, not just advisors, but combat units with tactical nuclear weapons. An American invasion wouldn't just be fighting Cubans, it would be fighting Soviet soldiers on Cuban soil. That meant direct military conflict between the world's two nuclear superpowers, with atomic weapons potentially being used on the battlefield. What happened next would determine whether civilization survived the next 2 weeks. Kennedy chose a naval blockade instead of bombing, which sounds reasonable until you realize that stopping Soviet ships on the high seas was technically an act of war. The Soviets had every legal right to fight their way through, and they had nuclear submarines in the area with orders to do exactly that. If you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, I'd love it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories about the moments that shaped our world. This is where things get absolutely terrifying. On October 24th, Soviet ships approached the quarantine line with nuclear submarines providing escort. American destroyers moved to intercept, not knowing that each Soviet submarine carried nuclear torpedoes and had authorization to use them if they felt threatened. The submarine commanders didn't need permission from Moscow. They could start World War III on their own. The most dangerous moment came 3 days later. A Soviet submarine designated B-59 had been underwater for hours, unable to communicate with Moscow, running low on air, with temperatures inside reaching over 100 degrees. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced that war had already started when American destroyers began dropping practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface. Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for launch. Here's the part that should give you chills. Soviet protocol required all 3 senior officers on board to agree before launching a nuclear weapon. Captain Savitsky wanted to fire. The political officer agreed, but the deputy commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. One man's decision in that moment saved potentially hundreds of millions of lives. If Arkhipov had agreed, that nuclear torpedo would have destroyed the USS Randolph and its 3,000 crew members, automatically triggering massive American retaliation. But even that wasn't the closest we came to nuclear war. On October 27th, the same day as the submarine incident, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down Major Rudolf Anderson's U-2 spy plane over Cuba, killing him instantly. The American military had pre-authorized immediate retaliation for any attack on reconnaissance aircraft. Bombers were already warming up on runways when Kennedy personally intervened to stop the retaliatory strike. At the exact same time, another U-2 pilot made a navigation error and accidentally flew into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept what they assumed was the beginning of an American first strike. American F-102 fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles took off from Alaska to escort the lost U-2 home. Soviet and American nuclear-armed fighters were minutes away from engaging each other directly. Meanwhile, back in Cuba, Soviet commanders were preparing for an American invasion that seemed inevitable. They had already moved tactical nuclear weapons, smaller warheads designed for battlefield use, into position and were authorized to use them against any American landing force. Unknown to the Americans, a full-scale invasion of Cuba would have resulted in nuclear weapons being used against American troops on the beaches. The communications breakdown between Moscow and Washington made everything worse. Messages took hours to transmit and decode, meaning decisions were being made based on outdated information. Khrushchev and Kennedy were essentially flying blind, making choices that could end the world based on intelligence that was already obsolete by the time they received it. What finally broke the deadlock was a secret deal that wasn't revealed for decades. Publicly, Khrushchev agreed to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. But privately, Kennedy agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, essentially giving the Soviets exactly what they wanted from the beginning. Both leaders could claim victory while stepping back from nuclear war. But the crisis revealed something absolutely terrifying about nuclear weapons and human decision-making. Multiple times during those 13 days, the fate of civilization came down to individual choices made by submarine commanders, radar operators, and fighter pilots who had seconds to decide whether they were under attack. Any one of dozens of people could have triggered World War III through miscommunication, technical failure, or simply bad judgment. The Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most famous near miss. Throughout the Cold War, there were dozens of moments when computer glitches, communication failures, or individual mistakes almost triggered nuclear war. In 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov received computer alerts showing incoming American missiles, but chose not to report it, deciding the readings were false. He was right. It was a software malfunction. His decision to trust his instincts over computers literally saved the world. In 1995, a scientific rocket launch from Norway was initially interpreted by Russian radar as a possible American submarine-launched ballistic missile. President Boris Yeltsin activated his nuclear briefcase, the first time in Russian history that the nuclear command system was fully activated for an actual alert. Only last-minute identification of the rocket's true nature prevented potential retaliation. What makes these near misses so terrifying is how often they came down to pure chance. Technical malfunctions, communication breakdowns, misinterpreted radar signals, navigation errors. Any one of dozens of mundane failures could have triggered the end of human civilization. We've survived the nuclear age not because our systems were perfect, but because we got incredibly lucky over and over again. The psychological pressure on leaders during these crises was almost unimaginable. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy was getting maybe 3 hours of sleep per night, making decisions that could kill hundreds of millions of people while dealing with enormous pressure from military advisors who wanted immediate war. The margin for error was essentially zero, and the consequences of mistakes were literally apocalyptic. Today, we're facing new nuclear risks that, in some ways, are even more dangerous than the Cold War. More countries have nuclear weapons, and some are led by increasingly unpredictable leaders. The command and control systems that prevented accidental war during the Cuban Missile Crisis are aging, and cybersecurity threats mean that nuclear weapon systems themselves could potentially be hacked or compromised. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught us that nuclear war could start not from deliberate aggression, but from misunderstanding, technical failure, or simple human error amplified by the unforgiving speed of modern warfare. In an age where hypersonic missiles can reach their targets in minutes and automated systems make split-second decisions, the margin for human judgment, the thing that saved us in 1962, is shrinking rapidly. What happened during those 13 days in October was in 1962 was essentially a preview of how World War III almost started, not from grand strategy or evil intentions, but from a series of small decisions and accidents that spiraled toward global catastrophe. We survived through a combination of wise leadership and pure luck. But luck isn't a strategy for long-term survival. But here's what most people don't realize. And this might be the most important part of this story. The documents and recordings from the Cuban Missile Crisis weren't fully declassified until the 1990s, which means we're still learning about other near misses that haven't been revealed yet. Intelligence agencies around the world are sitting on thousands of classified files about moments when the world almost ended, and most of those stories have never been told. That's a story for our next video because trust me, the Cuban Missile Crisis was just the tip of the iceberg. Make sure you're subscribed because what we're going to reveal next about the secret near misses of the Cold War will show you that we've been far luckier than anyone realizes. The hidden history of how close we've come to nuclear war is more terrifying than you could possibly imagine.